Hey everybody, welcome to episode 29 of the Real Talk podcast presented by Reformed Perspective. On today's show, we have on Mike Hutten from One Christian Thinks. He is the first returning guest, I believe. Now we had him on, as not an official episode, but a bonus episode.
It was two official episodes in one.
True, we had him on for a good long time, back around Christmas, I think it was.
That's right.
Yeah, so,
Christmas bonus.
And that was a lot of fun. We had a good discussion. We talked a lot about critical race theory. We talked about
a lot of
politics
stuff.
a lot. Yeah. Liberals, conservatives. Remember that?
Yeah.
So that was quite an engaging discussion.
Marxism.
Yeah. It was a bit all over the place. So I think today's episode we're going to make it a little more focused. That's the idea.
Drill down a little bit.
Yeah. So we got a nice little outline done up
Who
here.
are we trying to get? It's not going to be focused.
We'll get our best shot. Yeah. It'll be interesting and hopefully informative.
Yep.
And engaging. So I think the main theme will be freedom. What does freedom mean? What is freedom? How does that get played out in our daily lives? What sort of rights do we have? How does the government fit into that? The role of all these different types of things. So I think before we start into this discussion, though, maybe we should, just talk about, maybe Mike, just give a quick brief bio on who you are and just remind people if they haven't heard of you before, and what you do with the podcast. And then then we'll kind of jump into what is freedom and we'll go from there.
Yeah. So I started a podcast, One Christian Thinks. What was it? I don't know. I don't even know when it was. It was probably about a year ago.
Over a year.
Something like a year ago.
Yeah.
And
it's been on hold for half a year. So.
What's that?
It's been on hold for half a year.
Yeah, it has been busy with other stuff. So the podcast was originally to discuss politics and worldview when COVID started and when the Black Lives Matter protests were going strong. So I wanted to kind of discuss my thoughts on it. So I started a podcast and got my thoughts out there. And since then, I've put out a fair amount of content. I've read a book that I thought was really beneficial. This Story of Liberty. That's right. Almost forgot the title. Right now, I've got a small political / worldview discussion group started, and that's we meet regularly, and that's been a lot of fun. So we're kind of trying to take this discussion down to the individual level and talk about ideas with people. It's awesome.
That's pretty cool. And how have people been reacting to that? How's it?
They've been really enjoying it.
Yeah.
The group is going strong. People are really appreciating it. I was working on we can talk about this later perhaps, but I was working on a bit of an intellectual paper as well with another guy.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, nice.
So, yeah.
Cool. Neat. I think it's this is something people should start all over. I mean, whether it's just friends in the backyard chatting, something formal like that sounds like, well, it's kind of what we're doing here, but it's kind of fun.
Yeah, that's the whole point, right? You want to inspire conversations elsewhere. Yeah. And then also, I think it's just super helpful because you listen to what's going on in the news and maybe you have some favorite podcast or whatever, Real Talk. But One Christian Thinks, sorry, yep. But like you have all this information coming in, and to process it, it's really helpful to sit down with others and kind of work through your ideas and be like, okay, is this crazy or am I alone on this or what's the deal?
Everyone has different experiences and everyone. One thing that we discussed that I'll just throw out there is that no one this side of eternity will be able to fully understand the truth, but everyone can start to grasp a certain angle of it, right? Yeah. So then it's super important to have discussions with other people because you don't know what they know, and what they know might help you understand something else. So even if it's a challenging discussion, it's super important to have.
Yeah, that's cool.
There's so much to learn, and just being able to listen to such a skill, right? To hear what they're saying. So
for sure.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So, and you read The Story of Liberty. Everyone should go listen to that. Mike's got a great voice for audiobooks. Oh, it was awesome. I listened to it straight through. Yeah. I was like, some days I was like all the way caught up and waiting for the next one. I'm like, oh, come on. But
melodic.
You like almost binged it, Lucas. But,
last night. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's great. But I mean, it's actually a great story, and it gives me it gave me a way better idea of like the whole. I guess it's like the Reformation era.
Yeah, that's right.
From the Reformation moving forward, and kind of like, a lot of church history, and then a lot of like just world history. Yeah. So, and then it directly ties into our conversation here. So, the story of liberty, the story of freedom. Like, why did we?
Maybe give a quick overview on what the story of liberty is and why you chose to do that as a podcast.
So, the story of liberty is written by, I think it's Charles Carlton Coffin, who was an American in the 1800s, and he goes back to the kind of the 1300s in Europe. I think it was John Huss was the first person he kind of brings up. And he shows how liberty in medieval Europe developed through the preaching of the gospel. And how that kind of was brought over into North American culture, and it really shaped European culture as well. And he goes through all the reformers, and he goes through a lot of different explorers who explored North America. Yeah. He writes it in a story form. It's not a history textbook, and that's why I kind of enjoyed it. Especially in high school, I wasn't a history buff. And that this book really grabbed my attention because it's a story, it's a narrative, and he does a really good job of just making it interesting.
Yeah.
And showing how important these individual figures were.
Yeah.
So
yeah, it's really, yeah.
I found it captivating because you just, you follow the train of logic throughout time. And you're like, okay, so they did this, John Huss, John Wycliffe. Yeah. You get to Columbus discovering the New World.
Yeah, that's right.
Is he going to make it across the sea? I think I know the answer, but it's kind of cool to hear.
Well, you don't know a lot of those stories, but he tells it in a way that like it's not like a fictional storytelling, but it was also not like a history textbook where
that's
it's
right.
like, and then he came and then he did it. It was like, it would tell it in a way that's like, like it's a narrative, but it's also like, truth, and you got to get like a good point across.
Yeah, and you can see
really cool,
God's guiding hand through it all, using these rulers and tyrants,
and it keeps it moving. So it's like it's a lot of history to cover, and he keeps it moving in like every episode, or every chapter. Is like, it's short and kind of to the point, and it's like
that's kind of the challenge of it, is because there are a lot of names that are just thrown out, right? But it's still, I found it to be very, very beneficial. And he doesn't. One thing I like about it is it's completely not politically correct. Like he doesn't polish over anything. He just tells it how it happened.
Yeah, it's so accurate. Yeah,
and it was refreshing to read that for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, brutal times.
Yeah, brutal times. Absolutely,
a lot of death.
A lot of like he makes. Like he doesn't beat around the bush. Like there was bad stuff that happened.
It almost rivals. I would say it rivals the Bible in how it could be like
careful in your next words.
No, there could be like a flippant casualty, and you'd be like, oh, and then he was stabbed. And he was stabbed, and then we moved on.
Yeah.
But it goes to show you, like there were so many people who were like, oh, we're just offed, Okay,
and moving on. He was put to death.
Yeah, it was like okay, and here we go.
Yeah, that's history.
Yeah.
And like who was
Don't bring me into that 4 minutes.
Christopher Columbus, like the explorer whose name we all know, perhaps the first explorer we think of, died poor and destitute, right?
Yeah.
And it's like, oh wow.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And he was just a pawn in all these games of politics and Europe's leaders. Yeah. Kind of cool to see.
Cool. So why do we got to discuss freedom? That's what I want to know.
Well, I guess let's just back it up. What is freedom, Mike?
So it's a huge topic, and I want to preface what I say by saying that I am not studied in philosophy. There's people I'm sure who know a lot more about how freedom has been discussed historically.
How do you understand it?
How do I understand it? So I would say the current contemporary understanding of freedom is to be able to do what I want.
Yep.
Right? Generally, if people are talking about their freedom, it's about what they want to do.
Mm-hmm.
But I find that that's kind of a bit of it's a definition that's lacking, because we're intrinsically limited by who we are, right? And an easy example, it's a bit of a silly example, but it makes it very clear, is if I wave my arms up and down as hard as possible, I can even attach feathers to my arms. I'm not going to fly like a bird, right? I'm intrinsically limited by my being. I can't fly like a bird.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that I'll never experience freedom.
Yeah,
it just means that's not part of my nature.
Yeah, you don't have the freedom to fly.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So freedom can't mean the ability to do whatever we want.
Yeah.
I would love to fly like a bird. I can't.
That would be cool. That would be a good superpower.
Yeah. It'd be sweet. Superman.
Yeah.
Whatever. So it's got to be something different. So I was listening to one podcast. I think it was actually Jonathan Pajot. If you,
big fan.
Okay. So there we go. And he referenced kind of a historical definition of freedom, and essentially that was the ability to live out your nature in the most complete way possible. And I had to think about it for a while, but then all of a sudden it started to really make sense, because taking our example of not being able to fly like a bird, that's not part of my nature.
Yeah.
But then to be free would be to live out my nature in the greatest way possible. And so it's interesting. So if that's the way you start viewing freedom, then you can ask yourself, well, what is our nature? What were we created to do? And for this question, I always go back to the Westminster Larger Catechism. Or is it larger or longer? It's Larger Catechism. Question 1, what is the chief and highest end of man? Man's chief and highest end is to glorify God and to fully enjoy him forever. Right? So that's what we were created to do.
Yep.
That is our being. That's our nature. To glorify God and enjoy him forever. So then, if we define freedom as fully living out our nature, what we were created to do, then freedom is found in glorifying God and enjoying him forever. That's where freedom is. It's not in being able to do whatever we want.
Yeah.
And that's a fundamentally different idea of freedom.
Yeah, because the world doesn't think that at all.
No, not at all.
Because they don't accept the premise that we are created.
Right.
So freedom is doing whatever you want, I guess, perhaps inside your nature. Although we try to change our nature.
They don't admit what the nature is. So then you could just, instead of flying like a bird, you could become a woman tomorrow if you wanted.
Right.
So, which is, an interesting concept. You can't so much do that as you can fly like a bird. But now if you could just say that you can do it, well, then,
sure.
Then that turns into freedom. But then, so as Christians, then how do we, because we're understanding just the definition of freedom. And you alluded to that, we are created with this, well, in a way with this, we were created with this freedom, and it's been, stunted by sin. And now we're slaves to sin. And now we are no longer slaves to sin because of Christ's work. But is it important for us to go beyond just understanding, like, now we're not slaves to sin. Now we are free in say our spiritual nature? Or is it like, is there utility to understand that into like a practical world where we can actually discuss this with people in the world? Right.
So that's a great question, because a lot of Christians kind of, the feeling that I've gotten discussing freedom with other Christians is that freedom kind of starts and ends with freedom from slavery to sin, which is the freedom we get from Christ, right? And this definition fits very well in with that. If freedom is found in glorifying God and enjoying him forever, well, then we must not be slaves to sin anymore. Right. So it's a great place to start, but that freedom also has, it plays out in this world. Like we were discussing about the story of liberty, how Charles Coffin narrated that the Christian understanding of freedom actually affected the world and created freedom in the world, both in Europe and North America, right? Mm-hmm. So Christian freedom, properly understood, should have a very strong effect in this world. And
it started with the translation of the Bible with Wycliffe, right? And then just spread from there.
Yeah. So it's interesting in that book, he constantly brings up liberty of conscience.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
That's a strong theme, and that's directly linked to this. So in both the Westminster Confession of Faith, I think it's Article 20, and the Belgic Confession, I'm not sure which article it is, but in both of those confessions, liberty of conscience is referenced. What they acknowledge there, without, I don't want to misquote it, I don't have it in front of me, but I like how the Westminster Confession discusses it, because it acknowledges that conscience is of God. Conscience comes from God and from the Holy Spirit. And that liberty of conscience means we have the ability to follow the Holy Spirit's guidance in how to live out our Christian life. And to limit how we live out our Christian life with man-made rules and man-made laws would be exactly what the Pharisees did in the Old Testament, right? They put all sorts of man-made laws on God's people and restricted their liberty of conscience. So in this world then, if man-made laws start to restrict your liberty of conscience, your freedom to live out your conscience as guided by the Holy Spirit, that's a problem. So a comprehensive understanding of freedom allows for liberty of conscience, allows people in this world to live out their conscience.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah.
That makes sense. Is there a place for, because this is all on a very individual level.
Right.
What about the collective side of things? So if you're supposed to be able to live out your freedom of conscience to the best of your ability with inside your nature to the glory of God, and if the government puts in place laws and rules that impact your ability to exercise your freedom of conscience, is the church as a collective the counter to the government as a collective in terms of the church should be standing up for freedom of conscience? Or am I off base in making that comparison?
It's a real COVID argument there you're having.
Well, COVID is always the issue that comes to mind, but
it
like
slips in all the time.
Yeah, it finds a way in, but that's not necessarily what could be the case.
Yeah, sure. Totally. And I mean, if we look back in history, it was the church. It wasn't the church as a whole. Often it was usually one or two players.
Yeah.
And you can go from Huss and Wycliffe, and like you can add Calvin in there, and John Knox, and all those players, all the reformers that we kind of esteem.
Yep.
They all stood for liberty of conscience. Perhaps the one I heard, this isn't something I fully researched, but apparently Luther was starting to question complete liberty of conscience later on in his life because he saw the wars that it led to. But the wars that I can't discuss this authoritatively, but the wars that they led to were often to overthrow kind of dictatorial monarchs.
Tyrannical.
Right? Yeah. That's right. So
Who weren't respecting the freedom of conscience.
exactly.
Yeah.
So historically, yes, the church, or at least Christians, have fought for liberty of conscience. They were always the motivating force.
Yeah.
And we seem to, I don't necessarily want to say that the church should be rising up in this time to protest decrease of liberty of conscience.
Yeah.
But I do believe that the church has a role to maintain freedoms. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that, obviously ripples through our society. Like we've talked to several people about politics and how that, and ARPA and these things, like how us as Christians standing up for, liberty of conscience, liberty of expression, and, basically just our rights that now we believe have been given to us by the government.
Yeah.
Really benefits everybody. So,
Yeah.
What about the flip side of that, though? Because, so I guess if the church is supposed to be the bastion of freedom, and freedom of conscience be the primary of the freedoms, does the church not also have the responsibility, which would be the other side of freedom, to A, advocate for the freedom, and B, to take care of those in her charge, I suppose?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's the flip side of freedom, right? Everyone loves to talk about freedom, and everyone wants to be free. But with freedom demands responsibility.
Yeah.
Because if you're free to do something, then you're also responsible for whatever comes from your actions.
Yeah.
Right? So the church absolutely has a responsibility. If we're to promote liberty of conscience, the church has a responsibility to sort of maintain the environment that comes from that.
Yeah.
And it's an environment that certainly demands morality in society.
Sure.
Right?
It's a light.
Yeah,
light.
absolutely. Yeah. So the church must be a witness to society. Absolutely.
Yeah. I guess both as the institution and then also the church's members within their lives, whether that be, in their daily work or if they're in the government themselves, or that kind of thing. It comes back to like creation, I guess. We were created with that full freedom, right? Like you had talked about that previously also in your podcast.
Yeah.
I kind of wanted to dig into that because I really like that. Like this comes from a series that Mike did on freedom. This is why we, got him on to talk about this.
Yeah.
A great topic. So I think it would be helpful could you run through the creation, like to understand better as Christians what freedom really means and how that's built into, the creation that God, made, and then why that is now like built into the world. And now, you don't have freedom apart from God's design.
Right.
Like, cause you went through the commandments and then, basically like portrayed them kind of in the creation story.
Right.
So I don't know if you can do that, word for word or anything, but just briefly, so people can understand it. Yeah.
So what I did was I took the idea that freedom, the definition of freedom is to glorify God and enjoy him forever. How do we do that? We live out, to glorify God is to live out our thankfulness to him by obeying his law, right? And his law, generally, most people accept that his law is the 10 Commandments. That's sort of the moral code that we're to follow. Mm-hmm. So what I was trying to do was show how the 10 Commandments is actually embedded in the Christian story or in the creation story. Mm-hmm. Freedom in this world is to follow the 10 Commandments. Of course, we know that we're not saved through following the 10 Commandments. It's an act of thankfulness for salvation.
Yeah.
Right. But that's how freedom is found. And that should be our guideline to pursue freedom, is to actually obey the 10 Commandments.
Yeah. So it wasn't some arbitrary rules that God came up with, while the Israelites were in the wilderness, or,
right.
just to say, okay, well, we need some rules.
Right.
It wasn't something that was like an afterthought. It was built right in.
It was crystallized.
Built right into creation. Yeah. So for example, and my podcast goes through each one of the 10 Commandments and explains, or attempts to explain, how it's found in the creation story. Thank you. The one I'll bring up is one that I got some feedback on it, and the person that I received this feedback from was like, hey, you could have explained this commandment a lot easier. So it's
it's like you took the long way around.
A little bit. But so to honor your father and mother, right? That is the creation of a hierarchy. Mm-hmm. Right? Yeah. There's a hierarchy there.
It's not just family.
It shows somewhat symbolically that God created hierarchy. And that is seen in creation with Adam and Eve being the father and mother of all things living. Yep. So there is hierarchy in creation. That is where that commandment originated.
Yep.
And I go through all of the commandments that way, and it was an interesting exercise for me.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
Yeah. You really see the full dynamic, between freedom and responsibility,
right,
in the creation story, because they're created with ultimate freedom.
Yeah.
But then they have a responsibility,
which is another word that we throw around as Christians, but we don't really know what it means all the time.
Yeah.
Because free will, we don't really know what it means to have free will, but because we don't have a free will, this is something people don't, I had this clearly explained to me at one point.
Catechism class?
Probably, yeah, something like that. But
we'll say it was that early.
Yeah. We'll say it was that early. Yeah. Probably again a couple times after that. But Adam and Eve were created with a free will. And so that's like the ultimate freedom. That's like,
they were created with ultimate freedom. They had the ability to fully glorify God and enjoy him forever.
That's why,
right?
Because a robot can't do that.
Within the bounds of the rules, or the rules and the the governing structures that God put in place in the creation.
Yeah, which is right.
Yeah, which is fascinating. Something I thought when I was listening to that, the angels don't really have. That would be like the governing structures of this world is what makes us, free to play within this world, for lack of a better term. Something you pointed out when you gave an analogy of like a board game. If you were going to have someone over for a board game,
right.
Just a brief explanation of it. If someone had you over and, had chips and dice and a board and everything, and just you all sat down, and the guy, your friend said to you, okay, you go first. And you're like, I don't know the rules. Like, what are we doing here? Like, are we trying to go around the board? Like, what are we trying to? Without any rules, you can't make a meaningful move in life.
Yeah.
So you can't make a meaningful move in a game. So you can't make a meaningful move in the world.
Rules are necessary for freedom.
Yeah.
And I do have to acknowledge I got that metaphor from Jordan Peterson. So.
Oh yeah, no.
But yeah, with the rules that were established in creation by God, Adam and Eve had the ultimate freedom, right? But they also had the ultimate responsibility. With freedom comes responsibility. Yeah. They could literally destroy all of the perfect creation just by eating the fruit of one tree, just by disobeying God, right?
Yeah.
So that's the basis for both freedom and responsibility as humans.
Yeah.
That's interesting, yeah.
I like the symmetry there, though, because, so in the beginning, there is this tree of good and evil, and we think of it as Garden of Eden, perfect world.
Yeah.
but evil was always a present option there.
Yeah.
And
Because of
the serpent was there.
Yeah.
So that's part of the like the sandbox, the governing structures, as you kind of say. Like that's the world God created us in, because that would bring him the most glory.
Right.
And then to redeem us obviously brings him glory, and we live our lives in thankfulness to him. But
Right.
part of that thankful living must be the pursuit of freedom.
Yeah.
Because it would follow, to get back to that state, not that we do it ourselves, but through the Spirit in our hearts. Part of that is a pursuit of freedom, and freedom of conscience being the first one of those.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Because like this goes straight back to creation too. Love is impossible with freedom. A relationship isn't possible without freedom.
Yeah.
Without freedom. That's right. That's why the tree of knowledge of good and evil was in the garden, because God desired a relationship with Adam and Eve. The option had to be there for them to disobey him, because if he created them with only the option to love him, they would just be robots.
Which is a question people always ask. Is like, why was the option even there? If God, if God wanted us to sin, then why wouldn't he just make us sinful? And if he wanted us not to sin, why would he even put the option there? That's kind of the problem of pain in, a first principles kind of way, I guess.
Well, like, he wanted the option, or no, he wanted a relationship with us. He's a relational God, right? Which is why that tree was there.
See, that's something that's what I meant by the angels don't really have that. Because like although Satan is a fallen angel, so maybe I don't know. I mean, speaking way outside my realm, but I'm sure all of our realms,
Oh yeah, you haven't been to heaven?
No, not as such.
Me neither.
Yeah. It reminds me of, though, just for an aside, that Jordan Peterson, he said something. Maybe he was talking to Pageau or somebody. He said, if things get too good, our human nature is to find a way to screw it up so that we can, have something to strive toward. Because like if we don't have a burden to bear, then we, just mess everything up so that we can have a burden to bear. I like that just made me think about that with the tree of the knowledge of good and evil.
Yeah, right. Okay.
But also, like, if you think about in the States, it's like, it's getting too good over there. They're finding ways to screw it up. Because it's like, it's kind of boring.
Yeah.
So I wonder how that plays into this discussion of freedom. But
I mean, sinful nature always creeps in.
no matter what.
That's part of living on this side of eternity, right?
Yeah.
The glorious hope that we have is that is for an eternity with God, where there will no longer be a tree of knowledge of good and evil, because Christ has fulfilled all that role. He has united us with God. He has fulfilled that relational aspect. So there will be no more tree of knowledge of good and evil in the new creation, right? Yeah, right. Which is an awesome hope.
Yeah, definitely.
That because we'd find it.
Yeah, we always do. Yeah, like that Peterson idea you were referencing is actually he takes that from Dostoevsky. And it was that great quote about, like, even if man, like, if everything was perfect and all good, to, like, he would. I'll just read here. I pulled it up actually, but even if given economic prosperity, such that he should have nothing else to do but sleep, eat cakes, and busy himself with the continuation of his species, even then, out of sheer ingratitude, sheer spite, man would play you some nasty trick. He would even risk his cakes and would deliberately desire the most fatal rubbish, most uneconomical absurdity, simply to introduce into all this positive good a sense of his fatal, fantastic element.
Doesn't that just describe America, like, just down to a T right now?
Yeah.
It's like this whole. It was getting too good there for a bit.
Yeah.
Let's burn her to the ground.
Oh, in our country too, like in Canada.
Fair enough.
All the West, really.
Yeah.
It feels like we're searching for problems.
Yeah.
Not that there aren't still problems to solve, but we invent.
Yeah, but we sure are digging them up.
Yeah.
Quite literally.
Right now.
As if, the past couple of weeks, a lot of digging. Yes.
Yeah, it's been a problem. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, it was a problem for sure. You want to get into libertinism? Because I just learned how to say that word. So
yeah, big day for
just
Tyler.
learn what that word is.
Yeah.
Because
that's kind of where we're at right now.
Kind of where we're at. It's like why don't you explain it? I'll explain it.
The problem that a lot of people that I've heard that a lot of people have with sort of a complete individual freedom is that, well, it goes one of two ways. Or perhaps a complete individual freedom goes one way. It goes to libertinism. And to be a libertine is essentially to have no bounds, no morality, nothing restricting your movements. And that's kind of the contemporary idea of freedom, right?
Yeah.
But what I'm kind of arguing for here, that freedom is to glorify God and enjoy him forever, that has an absolute morality. That has a morality that can't be overstepped because it's part of the created order in this world and it's put in place by God.
Yeah.
So understanding this sort of absolute idea of freedom cannot lead to being libertine, to libertinism, because there is an inherent morality.
Yeah.
I know, I've heard people say that libertarianism, and my definition of freedom isn't quite libertarianism, but libertarianism in effect just leads to libertinism.
Yeah.
Just a loss of morality.
Yeah.
But I don't think that has to be the case as long as we're grounded in God. Right? As long as we maintain that God is sovereign, then we have an absolute morality that we cannot get rid of.
Yeah.
Cannot push it away.
The more amoral you become, then the more rules the government must put in place.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And once you turn to immorality, you turn away from God, then you also lose freedom.
Yeah.
You lose freedom both in the spiritual sense because you become a slave to sin.
Yeah.
And you lose freedom in the
Political sense. Yeah.
because the government has to step in and sort of hold people down a little bit.
Yeah. Well, again, like an American example, but like John Adams, we were discussing this before.
Yeah.
The Constitution requires a moral populace.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you don't have it, you'll lose your freedoms pretty quickly.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then rightfully so, I guess, for a government to, take your freedoms away because you can't be trusted.
Yeah.
So it's but the government's not free of sin either, which just becomes a problem.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then you get into Sam Harris's arguments pretty quick. Like, got to come up with our own morality, otherwise
A morality based on science.
otherwise then what?
Would you say libertinism is a freedom devoid of responsibility?
To a certain extent, it could be. It could be seen as that because there's a recognition that God's law and God's morality is the best thing, right? It's the best way forward. And if you look at how the Ten Commandments is set up, even in this world, living by those Ten Commandments, devoid of the spiritual aspect, actually is a positive. For example,
No, but I mean like libertinism,
Right.
the way it's played out.
right. So
Do you think that's just unabashed freedom without responsibility?
I think there's a connection there.
Yeah.
Because libertinism eschews morality, and that is going to have consequences.
Yeah, like take the obvious one would be sexual libertinism.
Right, exactly.
There's
And
obviously consequences.
There's
for-
all sorts of consequences that people would just rather ignore, and they do ignore through things like abortion.
Yeah.
Talked about
They
that
put
last
an end
time
to the
with
problem.
Mary. Yeah.
The problem.
Yeah.
Air quotes.
That's right.
So take the freedom, then fix the problem that it created.
Yeah,
Yeah. Again, in air quotes.
yeah. So that is a great example of libertinism avoiding responsibility. You have all this sexual freedom,
Yeah.
sexual revolution, and then the way to fix the problems that came up was abortions.
Yeah.
Abortions on demand, right? And that shows, I mean, it's tying it all together. That shows how far our moral compass has slipped, how misguided we are.
Do we see it in other areas of life, you think? Like economically?
Oh yeah, I think so.
Like stimulus programs, that kind of thing?
Well, stimulus programs, but also like you can look at big businesses that are run immorally without concern for
Yeah.
anyone they're affecting, stuff like that, right?
Yeah.
Amazon. Yeah. That's good.
Yeah. Post-Christian capitalism, yeah.
Yeah.
Amoral capitalism. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I mean, governments are not outside of that. If governments think they can do whatever they want,
Yeah.
and then ignore the responsibility through higher taxation or inflation or whatever,
Yeah.
they're not outside of that.
Yeah. You even see it as individuals too, right? Like just this ongoing, and we talked about this a bit previously on different podcasts, but I know in particular with Pastor Ian, this idea of expressive individualism, good on, in good measure, but that individualism has run amok.
Yeah,
And that
absolutely.
all we think about is ourselves.
Yeah.
And we live in a very self-centered culture.
Yeah.
We have algorithms that are directly tailored to ourselves. It's all about what's best for you.
Yeah.
Make your own choices. And now that leads to that extension of freedom which has gone too far because you take away the responsibility of it. So you're no longer responsible for your family situation.
Right.
You can just leave if things get rough.
Right.
Or people just don't see their family anymore because they don't like hanging out with their family.
Yeah.
It used to be, you can choose your friends, but you can't choose your family. You got to stick with your family. But more and more people are becoming like, there's a loneliness epidemic.
Yeah.
Like there's a ministry of loneliness in the UK.
Yeah.
And I would not be surprised if Canada went the same route.
Yeah.
Like the largest, I saw a stat the other day, the largest percentage of household type, single person.
Really? Eh?
Yeah. That just became like in the last year or so.
That's not even affordable.
That probably would reflect.
That was the last census data from 2020.
Okay.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That would probably reflect growing prosperity in the way that young people are moving outside of their family homes and establishing their own home.
Yeah.
But then not getting married, at least until much later.
That could be too. Yeah. Right?
Or if they're living in a basement, maybe it's considered a separate dwelling.
Perhaps.
Which in a lot of
Yeah,
ways.
but there is like
there's a lot of not married couples living together.
divorce. That as well.
single.
But divorce is rampant too. If you like, I had it in university talking to my classmates, and how many of them came from broken families. It was unbelievable.
Big majority.
Yeah.
Even late in life, like
Yeah.
absurd. Yeah. Interesting. I'm curious. So where does we talk about the government and we talk about individuals? Like, I understand that individual freedom is like, we live within the bounds that God has put in this world, and freedom is to live within basically the guidelines of the law that God has given us. And then also we talked about like the government is, as long as the populace is moral, they can kind of stay out of it. But as soon as it becomes immoral, which is clearly is now, they have to kind of step in, for better or worse, I guess, hopefully for better. But where do the two meet? So like we're talking about like economic stimulus packages and stuff. And and then the government's like, just inflate the dollar. It's like, well, you don't like the authority to do that is like, you created a problem and now you're fixing the problem by taking the freedoms away even more from the people who took the freedoms away at the beginning to fix things. Like, where do those two things meet? And then how do we as individuals, I guess, not just interact with the government, but how do we understand, our freedoms, we call them rights now, I guess, in relation to the government?
So that's a very big question. And it's a question that a lot of people have tried to understand over the past year and a half, especially.
I've just started like last minute and a half. So,
we're all Christians here. Let's talk the government's biblical role just very quickly.
Yeah.
If you go to Romans 13, there's a lot of people that like to stop at verse 1. If you go to verse 4 and 5, then it makes a case there for the government's role as ordained by God, because the government is a minister of God. That's often missed. That's the actual word that's used in Romans 13. It's the same as church deacons. It uses the same word. So the government is actually, it's put in place by God. It's a minister of God to do God's work, right? And God's role for the government is to promote good and punish evil. Okay, so what's good and evil? Is good and evil defined by the government? Is good and evil defined by God? Well, if we're talking biblical context, good and evil is defined by God. So what's really interesting then, and this is the general historical reform position as well, is that the government is to promote good according to God's word. And so it's to promote the church, and it's to promote living morally, and it's to promote freedom as well, because that is good as defined by God, right? And it's supposed to punish evil. So then if the government steps outside of that role and starts to define evil its own way and starts to define good its own way, then there's a very strong argument to be made, and this is an argument that I hold to. The government has overstepped its bounds and is no longer fulfilling its role, right? And if there's an authority that is no longer fulfilling its role, I believe there's a biblical model that in those areas, that authority is they've lost their
It's
authority.
been voided.
It's
Exactly.
exactly.
Yeah.
So then that's an authority that no longer has to be listened to. Not in every area, but in those areas where it's overstepped.
Yeah.
And we as Christians generally acknowledge this in the family and in the church.
Yep.
If there's an abusive father or something, he's overstepped his bounds, and something should be done to fix that situation. He doesn't have unlimited authority in the family.
No.
Right.
And the authority in that case would be the state to come in and take legal action.
Sure. That could be one of the actions.
Yeah.
There's situations where a wife is totally justified to remove her kids from that situation.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And some might say that's overthrowing his authority, but he stepped outside of his authority first.
Yeah.
Right. And we think the same of church leaders. Perhaps we don't realize it, but if an elder in the church was going to put you under church discipline for not taking a certain job, right? We'd say, oh, he's overstepping his authority. That's ridiculous.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It's a bit of a silly example because I don't know very many situations where that would happen.
No.
Right.
But we wouldn't feel compelled to listen to him, even though he is a spiritual authority over us, but he's overstepped his authority in that realm.
Yeah.
Right.
But we have a tendency to allow the government to overstep the limits of their authority and still maintain that we have to listen to them. But what if a government is abusive to its people? What if a government tries to force people to act a certain way outside of their realm of authority?
Yeah. And determining what that realm of authority is where the freedom of conscience comes in.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So a lot of people have this idea that government regulations are a necessary limit to personal freedoms. But no, they shouldn't be. If the government is a biblical government and we have an understanding of biblical personal freedom, then the government should actually be supporting personal freedom.
Yeah.
Its regulations should never be a decrease on individual liberty.
No. But we don't think about it like that. No.
No.
Do you think that goes back to the charter, or do you think that goes back farther in this country?
That's a really good question. I believe there certainly was a shift with the charter as basically introduced by Pierre Trudeau, Justin's father. And so the charter, the history behind the charter goes back a long ways, right? There was English common law. English common law goes way back into kind of the period of the story of liberty, sort of 1600s.
Was the Magna Carta even before that, though?
The Magna Carta was before that. The Magna Carta led to English common law being developed.
Yeah, right.
Because the Magna Carta realized that the king doesn't have divine right.
Yeah.
Right? The king actually has limits to his power.
Yeah.
That's basically what the Magna Carta acknowledged.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So then that developed, and as freedom developed in Europe, the Brits established a series of common law precedents. So what happened was they recognized that every individual had basically the maximum amount of freedom given to them by God. That was very recognized. And then if one person's freedom infringed on another person's freedom, then that matter would go to the courts, and the courts would adjudicate, and they would determine where one person's freedom stopped and the other person's freedom started. So like a common phrase is my freedom to swing my fist around ends at your nose. That ends at the tip of your nose, right? Yeah. So I don't have freedom to hit one of you in the face,
right?
No.
Right?
Thank goodness. Yeah.
Just about.
So, but these were the British courts, the English courts at the time adjudicated all these problems between individuals and society. And what they established over hundreds of years was a series of precedents that helped define our inherent rights and freedoms.
Yeah.
So that is a system that spread throughout the Commonwealth, throughout the British Commonwealth. It was kind of, from what I understand, it was the basis for the U.S. Bill of Rights and the Constitution.
Yep. Sure. Yeah.
But then what happened in Canada was Pierre Trudeau basically pushed all that series of precedents aside and wrote the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And there is still an acknowledgement of God as sovereign in the beginning, but those rights and freedoms were defined by the government rather than being established on sort of the maximum possible personal freedom as given to us by God. So that was a significant sort of philosophical shift in the understanding of freedoms in Canada.
Yeah.
So you don't think, even though the preamble says, whereas Canada is founded upon the principles that recognize the supremacy of God and the rule of law, you still think it's a shift to government mandated rights as opposed to, like, I'll make the counter case, like, say you had all these hundreds of years of political thought and precedent leading up to, they take all that, they combine it all, and they say, look, they don't use the American words, we hold these truths to be self-evident.
Yeah.
But they say, look, like, these are founded upon principles that recognize the supremacy of God and the rule of law. Therefore, let's lay it all out. What about the charter makes it government dependent as opposed to, I guess, natural law precedents?
Sure. I would say that, well, I'm not sure where it is in the charter, but it acknowledges that the government has the ability to decrease freedoms as outlined in the charter.
Demonstrably justified would be the phrase, probably.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
The government can decrease freedoms if they can show that decreasing those freedoms is necessary.
Yeah.
So I'd like to know where that is. Is that biblically found? Is that found on God's sovereignty? Can the government biblically decrease an individual's freedom? And how is it justified? So that's a big question, right? But then just the very fact that the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, well, I mean, all our law is supposed to go back to the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms.
Yeah.
Has the Canadian government governed in a biblical manner over the past 60 years? I would say the vast majority of them have not acknowledged God as sovereign, even though it's a preamble in the charter.
Yeah.
They have not acknowledged God as sovereign, right?
So now you're governing off a document that you're not even listening to.
And if you feel it's demonstrably justified to limit freedoms that are given to us by the charter, you're allowed to, right?
And they haven't. I mean, we've talked about this with COVID, but I can think about like compelling speech for like use of pronouns for a transgender person.
Right.
Well, is that demonstrably justifiable?
Right.
They use the argument in that legislation that you're basically committing a crime against this person. It would basically, they called it violence.
Yeah.
It was violence, like not to call them by their preferred pronoun. Well, if you think calling somebody by their preferred pronoun is violence, well, then maybe that's demonstrably justifiable. So now how do you
limit free speech,
define what that is? It's like, it's not up to you to define what that is. It's up to God and his law. Like,
ultimately what they're saying is then it's up to the courts and the politicians to decide if these restrictions on freedom are demonstrably justifiable.
Yeah.
And I think the important part to note is that whereas English common law allowed the courts to adjudicate, they adjudicated between individuals. They didn't adjudicate, well, it was a little bit, there was a parliament set up so they could decrease the power of the monarch. But right now it's the government putting laws in place to suppress freedoms often.
Correct. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And that's happening more and more. We see with Bill C-10. Bill C-10 is an absolutely ridiculous bill. Thankfully, it got shut down in the Senate. I don't know if you guys heard about that.
For now, they're on summer recess. Now, if there isn't an election, they'll be right back at it in the fall.
Right.
It's brutal legislation.
Yeah,
like,
Bill C-10. Basically, it's
people are surprised when you if you tell them about that people don't know about it. It just like blows people away.
Yeah, it's a piece of legislation that allows the government to define hate speech essentially and criminalize it,
and also to monitor that online.
Yeah,
and so that it basically is taking away all your
gives them the power that YouTube has right now to regulate creators,
right?
And gives the government that power.
Regulate freedom of speech, which makes it not
YouTube, any other big platform,
speech.
Right?
Yeah.
But so there you see an example of the government defining what is good and evil. The government has the ability to define what is hate speech.
Yeah.
And I mean, so far we've seen that they've defined not calling a transgender person by their preferred pronouns, that is hate speech, right? So I mean, there's no biblical grounds for that.
There's no limit to what it could go, where it could go.
Exactly. And then we saw, Bill C-10 has been passed through the House. We saw the introduction of Bill C-36, which expands those powers even further. Bill C-36 is a very scary bill. If Bill C-10 receives royal assent, then Bill C-36 is coming down the pipeline, and that restricts those freedoms even further.
Yep.
People are always shocked when I say that in Canada we do not have freedom of speech. Yes, it's in our charter, but we do not have it.
No, like just reading through this too, like it's actually so contradictory.
Yeah.
Like it talks about, like, okay, even in the beginning, like we said, like, okay, so recognize the supremacy of God and rule of law. After that, okay, that's fine. But then it also says, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms guarantees the rights and freedoms set out in its subject only to such reasonable limits, again, very vague, prescribed by laws that can be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society.
Right.
That is a tremendous amount of leeway.
But then the assumption right there is that the government has the authority to tell you what's what, and you have to basically prove that you're within your bounds to act freely, that's absurd. It doesn't say anything in there like, okay, unless we can prove from the Bible that, this is within, the nature in which we should be acting, then we can It made me think when we were talking about the English common law, that they were the first people to come up with a court system that was maybe not the first, but definitely the most common, that you're innocent to proven guilty.
Yeah.
Which sounds like, oh, that's cool, right? That's like
That's pretty cool.
I mean, that's what we have, right? We don't really know any different. But if you really think about where that comes from, is like what we were saying. Like, if the Magna Carta said every person has freedom, and the king doesn't have, divine authority over everything.
Yeah.
Then you have the freedom to go out and do whatever until it meets up with your neighbor's freedom. Yeah. Like right at the tip of his nose. Well, then you have to be innocent until you're proven guilty, because you have the freedom to act.
Yeah.
But if it's not that way, if you're guilty until proven innocent, then you're being governed by a law that you're not really a part of in your essence. Like, when you were created, you weren't necessarily part of freedom. You were given freedom by someone.
Right.
And so the government gave you it.
If
you were born as a citizen, then the government allows you, like, this would be like, you go to North Korea, it's like, you're not, you're assumed that you're not allowed to do something.
Yeah.
What you're allowed to do is what we tell you you're allowed to do.
You're presumed guilty.
Right. And you're presumed guilty, like, you're across the board, you're not free.
Yeah.
And you're guilty.
And
so
that's been a standard through so many societies and through so much of history. In the medieval times, the king had the divine right, or the monarch, the king or queen had the divine right, and they could decide the fate of someone's life.
Yep.
And
they did in the story of liberty.
Yeah. And realistically, that's not too different from what we see in places like China, where the Communist Party in China can, like, the atrocities that they're committing is unbelievable almost. It's
their basic dictatorship allows them to get a lot done.
Yeah.
To quote our prime minister, but
yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
But is that what he said?
Oh yeah,
that's brutal.
Yeah, it's crazy actually.
Yeah. But that's exactly what not having freedom means. It's like, now the government can do whatever they need to do
whatever they want.
And so, I mean, that document, like the charter, is pretty close to being it's terrible.
It's very much, it represents where we are today and why we got there.
Right.
And like how, we're not North Korea, but we're also not America. America is, like you say, the assumption is, like, I'm an American and I can do what I want.
Well, you just know, like, you get that feeling when you're like, okay, well, this would only happen in America. Like the Tiger King. It's like, things like that.
Oh, like can own 100 tigers.
Things that are absurd, that you're like, that cannot exist in this world. It happens in America. It's like Florida. That's where it happened.
It's really interesting because I know many people would object to this, but there's a recognition, and there was a recognition among Reformed people as well. If you go back to the Dutch politicians back in late 1800s, early 1900s, guys like Kuyper, there's a recognition that America was founded on these principles, on the basically there's two principles: that God is sovereign, and we must have liberty of conscience. Right? Now, people don't necessarily like to hear that because, well, that means that you could make a strong argument that the American Revolution was actually a positive, a good revolution. a revolution that was fought on biblical principles. And well, that if we that's a challenging thing to try to understand, because that means that in certain cases it might be acceptable for Christians to overthrow an authority.
Yeah.
Right. And then you have to wrestle with, in what situations would that be acceptable?
Yeah.
Right.
So that's a challenging discussion to have, and it is for sure.
Well, I think, and I think the reason why it's challenging is because we're used to enjoying freedom. We're used to
a government that generally supports the church.
Yeah. And then also human rights.
Right.
So I hate saying human rights, because human rights makes it seem like, even the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, it makes it seem like the government's deciding what that is.
Right.
And then you can very easily be like, well, okay, well, no, as long as you use pronouns, then you have rights. Like,
right.
It's like, wow, that's not freedom. So, as set, into play by God. But I think we're used to having, some form of freedom that feels comfortable.
Right.
And then we're okay with you taking just a little piece. Like, even right now, so what is this? Like, we're in July. Are we in an emergency state with COVID?
We are. Ontario.
So we are still in an emergency state. Well, okay, first of all, let's not get into COVID because it's insane. But we're still like 30% not even 30%, 15% in church.
I'm not even sure.
We worship outside. We're making concessions for all these things. Yeah. And everybody, it's like, there's capacity limits in Costco, and there's capacity limits. So the government's telling people that they have a limited capacity to be free, basically, and to perform their government or perform their business, and then also worship and all that. And because it was so much worse before, everyone's just like, okay, we're back to, I honestly don't even really notice.
Yeah.
It's like I slap a mask on, which I'm annoyed about, and then I walk into a store and, I don't go into a lot of stores and I buy a lot of stuff on Amazon. You just get away from it. And now, if you were to tell me that, we're only ever going to go back to 50%, I'm like, it's like, whatever.
It's better than it could be.
Right. So then, because of how bad it's been, now you get some freedom back. You feel good about it.
Right.
But I feel like we've been in this state where we've had the freedom, and now we're willing to, dispense with it.
Right. And I mean, it comes back to what we were originally talking about. Freedom demands responsibility, but people like to give up responsibility. And we've seen that over kind of the past 60, 70 years, when the welfare state really was implemented in North America, Canada, and the States. Yeah. We saw the government take more and more responsibility for people's lives. And an interesting example is healthcare. A lot of people support government-run healthcare because it gives healthcare to everybody. Yeah. But what happens with it? What happens is that the government actually takes responsibility for your health. Your health is it's not seen as your responsibility anymore, which is why the government almost has to impose all sorts of restrictions when there's a public health issue, because it's their responsibility to keep people healthy.
Yeah, that's interesting though, because but that sound. If you asked me to take that responsibility back, I don't think I would.
So now where does that level of freedom start? Man, I sure ain't coming up with good treatments for cancer. Sure. Personally, even for my family. With that, there's a recognition that, governments rarely come up with treatments for cancer. It's usually private business. Yeah.
Right. Go for the best cancer treatment. Where are you going?
But to the hospital at the government.
America.
So for example, one example of this that's very pertinent is that within all the COVID restrictions and all the COVID recommendations, there was very little talk, especially on the political level, of what each individual could do for themselves. Mm-hmm. There was almost none. It was actually specifically avoided by public health officials. Huh. Things like, and they're proven interventions that you can do on the individual level. Exercise, vitamin D, a variety of other things. Experimental treatments that showed promise in a lot of other situations were not allowed. We're actually not allowed to be discussed within Canada. So I know a guy who actually ended up in the hospital with COVID, and he asked the COVID doctor there, hey, what can I do? What can I do to kind of get over this faster? And the COVID doctor said, well, if your breathing gets worse, we're going to stick a ventilator in you, and that's it. And he's like, no, what can I do? Can I take, I don't know what they are, ivermectin or the other variety of experimental treatments? And the COVID doctor said to him, we can't discuss that. It's not even allowed to be discussed because the government has determined that it has responsibility for your health.
Yep.
See that? Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Well, and they don't want to take the risk to give the individual doctor, the freedom to make a call for an individual patient in this circumstance.
That's coming down the pipe with obesity, even.
Right.
It's like, you can't call me fat,
Exactly.
but you're unhealthy.
You know,
Like, you're not just like, it's not like we don't like how you look. It's like, you got diabetes and you got a problem.
yeah, statistically,
And now it's
obese
becoming-
people have
yeah.
more health problems.
And so here's what we
Shocker.
statistically know works.
Yeah.
How about you? No, can't say that anymore.
Right. Because people want to, whether it's people want to or people have gotten accustomed to the government accepting responsibility for them. Right. And that's every time the government accepts responsibility for something, it decreases our freedom.
Yeah, let's talk about the responsibility thing more, because that really struck me when I was listening to your series. Like, freedom is, I would say, like, definitely, like, it is followed by responsibility.
Yeah,
Like,
absolutely.
You have freedom, but now you have to take responsibility for what actually happens to you.
Yeah.
And then that also means, like, in your life for those around you personally, and then as, small collective of your family, larger collectives.
Yeah.
So maybe just more examples would be good. Like, healthcare is one, but can you think of any other, like, examples of where, like, responsibility really is something that we don't always want? It's like,
No, exactly.
no, with healthcare, but, like, how nice is it just sit at home and play video games?
Yeah.
Pretty nice.
Yeah.
Just collect that
For a little
CERB
bit.
money.
Yeah, collect the CERB money and sit at home.
Responsibility is difficult, and it's scary because you have to acknowledge that what you do might have consequences that you don't like. Right. The flip side of that is, and I think Jordan Peterson talks about this, is when you accept responsibility in the greatest way possible, you also live the most fulfilling life.
Do you think that's tied into the meaning crisis? I mean, obviously, a lack
Absolutely
of the
it
gospel,
is.
but also
Yeah.
people are, shifting away from responsibility at a rapid rate.
And I mean, if it's completely tied, because if you're not responsible for something, then I mean, you have less meaning, right?
Yeah.
If you accept responsibility, then your life more and more becomes filled with meaning.
Yeah. To give yourself rules, to have a code to live by, aka God's law in this case,
Yeah.
that gives you purpose and meaning, and it gives you a standard to
Yeah.
live to.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Responsibility is so important for sure.
So is it self-imposed rules? Because there's, like, the government can give you rules, and then, I mean, obviously God's law gives you rules, but not everyone's looking at that.
So yeah, I think, and you see it with guys like Jordan Peterson, right? He's got his 12 rules for life, and then he's got
12 more
12
rules.
more
for the-
rules, right?
So 24 rules for it. Yeah.
And there's self-imposed rules. Interestingly, a lot of, like, in those books, in those rules, there's a lot of biblical principles, right?
It's almost like he knew what he was doing. Yeah.
Almost God or Jordan Peterson.
Well,
Well,
God
both.
for sure.
Both, probably. Yeah.
So I would argue that the way to, like I've explained, the way to true freedom and true meaning in life is to follow God's principles, right? Because they're inherent in creation, and they're how we live out our nature to the fullest extent,
Yeah.
right?
You see it in guys like Jocko Willink, you know who Jocko
Yeah, Jocko. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Discipline is freedom.
Discipline is freedom, and I mean, Jordan Peterson is full of the same stuff.
Yeah.
So it's almost like there's a resurgence of this
Yeah.
as most of society is trying to push away responsibility.
Yeah.
Then you have these guys, and I would even say Joe Rogan.
Yeah.
Right?
That too.
You have these guys that are very big cultural icons
Yeah.
who are talking about this and saying that you have to be disciplined to have freedom, and you have to live by a code, and you have to take responsibility.
Yeah.
And it's recognized that leads to a more fulfilling life.
Yeah.
Often they're devoid of the spiritual aspect,
I was gonna say, yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's coming from it's like a conscience that's,
Right.
it's there.
Yeah.
Like, yeah.
It may work for this world, or at least for a time, but you're still relying on your own principles and your own rules if you don't have God's law underneath that.
Well,
Right.
or the principles that are inherent or that you've grown up with in the culture that is or used to be based on God's word. So you're relying on your parents and the society that in general that raised you, hopefully the mostly moral.
Yeah.
You know,
But if we're relying on man's code, well,
I mean, clearly it's a disaster.
we
but
acknowledge man's inherent sinfulness, right? So any man-made principle is going to be sinful as well, and it's going to go somewhere we don't want to go.
But I think the reason why it works for a lot of people is because they're pulling from biblical principles.
Absolutely,
Like, take care of yourself, take care of your family.
yeah,
And like, take care of yourself isn't like this, like, be a self-care sort of
No,
thing.
that's right.
It's like work hard,
yeah.
like work out,
clean your room,
eat healthy.
And I think part of the reason that a lot of these guys end up kind of coming up with their own principles or their own code
self-helpy kind of.
is because we have such a strong Christian foundation to these countries still,
Yeah.
right? And they're drawing from that heritage.
Oh, of course.
And
yeah.
they end up having a lot of Christian principles in their ideas, even though they might not be explicitly Christian themselves.
Possibly unwittingly as well too, because we are created and because these principles are true and timeless.
Yeah.
Just by virtue of living in this world and experiencing real life and gaining that experience, people can learn these principles. Like, they are somewhat natural in that sense.
Oh, yeah. Well, don't kill people. Seems natural.
Yeah.
Well, it's not natural. It's, become natural because we've accepted.
Or just like how delayed gratification is a much better long-term strategy than instant gratification.
Right.
Yeah.
Like, you can't just, go out and party all the time. Like, you should probably,
It's built right into the world.
yeah.
So that's like those things
Establishment.
that from that God in God's creation have just shone through as, truths people can't really get rid of. So
Yeah.
But that makes me think of Sam Harris again, because it's like you could argue that, well, like for people who don't know, he argues that you can come up with a moral compass on your own just based on the way that what's the word that he uses?
I'm not 100% sure what
Human
word
flourishing is usually is
Yeah, something like that.
Comfort or like
key.
basically the good and the evil and you know what pain is and you know what good is. So it's like good versus bad.
So
And if everyone knows that, you can come up with your own code.
If each individual, kind of exercises what would be best for their life, you'll end up at some sort of moral code.
Yeah, which is so it's an insane thing for him to even say, because you grew up in a country where that's not the case. So how do you grow up in a framework that's not that and then try to come up with that? It's
Or
like,
well, he's grown up in a country. He's like in his 50s or something. Like, he's grown up in a time where that's what America has done, and that's what the West has done. It's been every man to himself. Like, do what you find right in your own eyes.
Yeah.
And we've seen this rodeo before. Like, in Judges,
Yeah,
it doesn't go well. And the
doesn't
cycle
go
gets
well.
shorter and shorter every time.
I don't know if you guys have read his book, The Moral Landscape.
No, I've
I
not.
don't know if
like-
I'd be able to pick it up.
I've worked through it, and it's like he acknowledges the holes in his argument,
No, it's like
but
Darwin.
he carries on with the argument anyways. And it's like you just shot your whole argument, like you just debunked your whole argument that it's not possible because some people might think that they're flourishing by abusing other people, and then there's your whole morality.
You see that through tyrants all throughout history. That's like that C.S. Lewis quote. Like, I forget it exactly. I'm paraphrasing, but like, the worst person to be under is like a tyrant who thinks he's doing it for your good.
for your own good. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Which was, you see a lot of that in like the Inquisition in the Middle Ages or whatever.
Yeah.
In the Reformation.
That doesn't define our government.
Yeah. Our government,
to a T,
we're doing it for your
right?
good. There's unlimited taxpayer funded abortion, unlimited taxpayer funded euthanasia,
This is progress.
Wear a mask.
unlimited taxpayer funded serve. Like, it's just, it just keeps going on.
Yeah.
All right, where are we going from here?
Yeah.
We talked a little bit about kind of authority structures, and I want to hit on that again because it's an interesting idea. Just the fact that, and it's easy to target governments, but I also want to discuss a little bit about other authority structures as well, family and church authorities. Just how there's kind of the interplay of freedom and responsibility there as well, right? So government's low-hanging fruit, so I'm going to pick it. When the government develops, for example, a welfare program, they're trying to take care of the people who can't take care of themselves, essentially, right?
A noble goal.
A noble goal. We acknowledge that there are times when someone can't take care of themselves, whether that's severe mental health problems or severe illnesses, stuff like that.
Yeah.
We acknowledge that people can't take care of themselves. But what's happened now, the welfare system has existed for approximately 3 generations. We've had 3 generations on welfare. There are 3rd generation recipients of welfare because the government is not capable of understanding when to give people their responsibility back and when to give people their freedom back. So if the government steps in a situation and gives someone disability payments because they injured themselves at work or whatever, and that person starts to regain function but wants to keep gathering the disability payments, the government often can't realize that, right?
It's very hard.
It's very hard.
Without boots on the ground.
Right, exactly. You have to monitor everything to
Every
be able to do
individual.
that. And the government simply isn't big enough to do that. So
Bigger government.
Well, you end up it still is an impossibility. And I mean, that's what the Soviets found. So because once you have helped out in a situation, the proper thing to do is as the person gains the ability for more responsibility, you also give them more freedom, right? So the government is incapable of doing that because it can't assess every situation at the local level.
Which makes sense.
And so we have this in the family as well. Children are specifically given to parents because parents properly raise their children by being very involved in their lives and recognizing when children can handle more responsibility and thus also greater freedom.
Yeah.
And that develops a person, right? That allows a toddler to develop to a functional adult who's capable of thinking for themselves.
Yeah.
So if we take that to the welfare example and healthcare or whatever else, if a person who is incapable of their own responsibility, being responsible for their own life, is first helped by their closest circle, their family. In the absence of their family, it would be their closest community. Then that community can recognize, hey, this person can accept more responsibility. We should give them more freedom. Maybe it's they can do their own groceries now. Excellent. Or they can cook a meal for themselves. Let's let them do that. And that allows people to build their sense of meaning as well, allows them to develop themselves out of whatever trauma or struggle or mental health issue they're dealing with. Right. But the government can't do that. The government's not big enough. It's simply like a logistical impossibility.
Yeah, or it's too big and too far away.
It's too big and too far away. It's centralized, and then it simply can't monitor everything that it has to.
It's almost like, and this might be a crazy theory, but it's almost like you should join a local community group that could take care of you. Something like a church. Yeah,
that's so interesting. That
100%.
The parenting thing makes me think because the parent, trying to learn how to raise a kid. Well, I kind of think I'm just seeing it on both sides. Like too much responsibility for a child isn't good. Like you can't expect your kid to make
throw them in the deep end.
Gender decisions at 4.
Yeah.
If like gender's a decision. Man.
Yeah, you accepted the lie.
Worldly individual. Well, too much responsibility for a kid. Everyone knows that's no good. So, but then too much freedom on the other side. So like, even the economic thing is like, okay, well, you can pay somebody their entire life, take away all their responsibility, take away all their freedom, basically.
Yeah.
Pay them on welfare. Or you have a kid who's, a millionaire's kid and all the guy does is throw money at him.
Right.
Well, he's got unlimited freedom. Like, that kid's not any fun.
He doesn't learn responsibility either.
Okay, maybe he's really fun, but it's a terrible situation, right? Like there's just as many terrible situations on one side as there's on the other.
Right.
So somewhere up the middle is what parenting is.
Yeah.
And I don't know which side of the middle I'm on, but I'll figure that out, I guess, at some point.
Get off the fence,
maybe
pal.
one kid is like, well, I mean, like even growing up, it was like, okay, I mean, I think more on the, less freedom, more responsibility side, growing up, maybe a conservative home. But then I had friends who were like much more on the, hey, here, have some money, take the car. Let's go. I don't need to know where you are for a few days. It's like, and I'm like, oh, I wish I was that kid. But now I'm like growing up, I'm like, I don't think I wish I was that kid.
Freedom and responsibility have to balance each other out.
Right. And so like and then obviously you see it carrying through into adulthood, but like, I mean, it makes me think as a parent for sure.
Yeah.
Hopefully it makes other people think.
Yeah. You can have a car, but you have to get a job to pay for the gas.
Right. But if you let that go with too much freedom, it's like, okay, but now you're just
But
yeah, I don't know.
you end up in a place where you don't have freedom anymore. You become essentially a slave to those handouts, right?
Yeah.
And then you no longer have freedom. You're a slave.
Would you guys are both parents. Would you be anti-allowances then?
Well,
Could you use them as a reward though for doing
Not
work?
if they buy the grass seed for the lawn that they're caring for.
Yeah.
I think that could be judged on a kind of an individual basis.
At 2 years old, yes, I'm against allowances. Yeah.
But it would have to be done in a way to teach responsibility as well,
Yeah.
for sure. Because if you're giving a handout, you have to also teach responsibility to use that properly, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. We were just always paid with a meal. It's like, you're getting supper. Do the chores.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Well, a lot of parents are
Okay.
like, well, okay, we're not going to give you an allowance, but you can live here for free. So there you have it.
Yeah.
Appreciate that.
Yeah, so appreciate that.
Like, I'm 12. Get to work. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just an interesting thing to think about. So I'm, my interesting tirade. I don't know.
But it also happens in the church, right? When we so often in the church cultures we live in, we accept a certain way of life, and that ends up in a way turning into a rule and restricting people's freedom to live out their conscience as they would see fit. So
Okay, well, that's really interesting.
Yeah,
We talk
and-
about that a lot.
So Mike's coming out against 2 services. No. Just kidding. Just kidding.
I have liberty of
coming out
conscience.
against
liberty
the
of
Psalms.
conscience.
This is how they go.
I'll be on the beach. Thank you.
No Genevan tune. No, it's good.
But it's something that as Christians we really have to understand before we can expect to see it in society, right? So one kind of funny example that I was just talking to another Christian recently, and he's been through a fairly large number of different churches. He's a little bit more on the emotional side. He likes to raise his hands when he sings, right? Now, how many churches would he get kind of stared at, right? But
all the ones I've been to.
he actually feels a conviction to raise his hands when he's singing because it's part of an emotional response to God, right? So we as Christians, and there's so many examples of the little cultural norms that become, in a way, rules without being rules that end up restricting people's liberty of conscience, right? And so we as Christians, I think, have to be extremely aware of that, whether we create rules purposefully or inadvertently. We have to be extremely aware of how we might limit each other's liberty of conscience.
Yeah, you see this in the the missional traditional sort of approaches to churches, right?
Yeah, often.
To be, on the one side, okay, you want to be missional, so you want to be more sensitive and seeker sensitive and be, that definitely has its pitfalls, but I think part of that is what you hit on there is looking for the micro rules or like the unsaid rules that have just been traditions or like they often just come from culture, from your background.
Yeah.
That aren't necessarily scriptural, but they might be good in and of themselves, but can act as a bit of a roadblock to those looking for a faithful church, but don't come from that same background.
Right. So we have to recognize what is the essence of the Christian faith.
Yeah.
I mean, that's very easily summarized in like essentially one phrase: salvation by faith in Christ's sacrifice for your sins.
Yeah.
And thankfulness to or living out God's law out of thankfulness for that. Right. So if you believe that, you're a Christian.
Yeah.
And yes, there are certain principles that we can establish out of that and are necessary to establish, but we have to recognize that if someone believes that, then yes, they are a Christian. Now, there might be differences in how we express that Christianity, but conscience is from God. Yeah. And if someone is convicted and they believe in Christ's sacrifice for their sins, they believe in that's the only way to salvation, and they believe that they are convicted to do something, and that's how they live out their Christian life, then we have to allow liberty to do that. Now, there's limits, of course, and the limits are probably defined by God's law. So, I mean, you can't have a conviction to divorce your wife because you don't like her and remarry someone else.
Yeah.
That's not a conviction coming from God.
Yeah. That's
pure selfishness. That's your own desires.
Yep.
But then
those get hard to monitor.
they get hard to monitor. Right. But I think, so there's a few things to it. You can, I forget the text and I don't want to misquote it, but you can see someone's faith by their fruits, right? So you can see when someone is walking a Christian life by sort of what they do. But we've got to be careful to say, oh, that person is, we've got to be careful to not say, oh, that person is worshiping God different than I would. They must be wrong.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, no.
Because that often happens. And I think we all have a tendency to do that in our self-righteousness.
Yeah.
Right. So we've got to be very careful with that.
Yeah.
So
If we as Christians expect to see or hope to see freedom propagate in society, then we have to understand it first.
Yeah.
And we have to live it out in our churches.
It's tricky too. Yeah, you got to be real open, like not too open, so
that's right.
Your brain falls out. But
like I've heard that, like said, like, do you think that heaven's going to be like what a Canadian Reformed church looks like?
Right.
And I don't know anyone who I've ever talked to who said, oh yeah,
Right.
Like, but at the same thing. So I'm thinking, like, when I grew up, it's like you grow up into, let's say you were part of the Amish community or Mennonite. You grow up into something that you don't really know what's right or wrong. Some people embrace it and they think it's the way it should be.
Yeah.
And some people, turn their back on it and say, that's insane. And then they go off their entire life. They just spout off about how insane it was.
Yeah.
Well, like, how do I know then? Like, I'm not convicted to raise my hands when I sing.
Right.
But I could tell you almost with certainty that part of that's because I never raised my hands when I sung ever.
Right. Right.
Right. And so I grew up and no one raised their hands. And I
try it on Sunday.
looked around and I thought, yeah, maybe I will. We're outside. It's like
out
everything
Cornerstone.
goes outside.
Yeah.
Shorts and flip flops. Put the hands in the air.
Yeah.
Well, like, I'm just thinking, like, I'm not convicted to do that.
Right.
I understand if someone else is. And
Right.
I personally don't have a problem with it.
Yeah.
I would say it would be
different.
an interesting conversation in our churches because no one does it.
Right.
So then you get into, conversations of, well, okay, is it something that we need to be doing? Is it something that everyone should be participating in?
Or is it
will there be
something-
more people joining in doing it? Like, I don't know.
Is it something that should be left to personal liberty of conscience?
Maybe. Yeah.
Right. So
Right.
that.
But is it something that's showy or is it like, that's the
Right,
conversations
sure.
we would have?
Sure. Yeah.
For me, I'm just not convicted to do that.
Right.
But part of that is because I've just never done it, nor have I seen someone do it.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I get it's a cultural thing.
It is to a certain
But
extent.
I hate the argument that it's like, your experience is different than mine, and therefore, yeah, I don't know. I mean, obviously we can all learn from each other, but it doesn't mean that, the
There
way
isn't
that we
truth.
grew up is all wrong because
Right.
we haven't
Sure.
opened ourselves up to like the creativity of like a child.
Yeah.
Where like we just do whatever.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if you want to do that, that's an experiment you could run. Like, let your kids decide everything.
Kids,
See
lead
how
the
that
worship
goes.
service.
So good.
Right? I can guess they might not be in the church after. It's like,
But
right?
so within that, like we still must acknowledge biblical principles for Christian life, right? We still must acknowledge that God ordained his rule of law as guide for our life of thankfulness. We have to acknowledge that our like both freedom and responsibility, we have a responsibility to live according to God's law. So we can't let those things slide and say, freedom of conscience, everyone can do what they want. No, freedom of conscience only exists under God's law, right? So we can't let one thing slide for the other.
Mm-hmm. We're all held to the same standard. We're all
We
held
are.
to the law.
That's right.
we had a conversation with the church order. Well, does the freedom of conscience and the freedom of, does the freedom of your conscience only exist under our church order, Canadian Reformed Church order? Or is it
Right.
Canadian Reformed Church order and URC church order?
Right.
Or is it just church order?
What about the
Or is it
Presbyterians?
doesn't need church order, it just exists?
Right.
So now, like, but yeah, there are rules that govern our world because God has put them in place in order to create freedom for us.
Yeah.
I think the same goes for the church. Like, there is a level of guidance and I don't want to say tradition, but there's some element of that
Well, there is a
that
recognition.
that can better govern in order to produce freedom. I don't know.
Sure.
Yeah.
There is a recognition that every church will kind of structure itself through its church order and through its whatever.
Founding documents.
Sure, that there will be a certain culture in a church. But once that's established, and perhaps if you don't like it, then perhaps there's another church that is a better fit for you. But we have to be careful that once that's established, we don't start looking down on other churches because of it, right?
Yeah.
There's somewhere else I was going to go with this, but I've lost it. So
no, yeah, it's fine. Like the church order, if it infringes on your conscience,
right,
you should either first bring it up Matthew 18 with people in your church and your elders and try to work that out.
Yeah, totally.
If it still afflicts your conscience, perhaps try to get it changed, and you can always go through the processes through synod and whatnot, like we talked about in that church order episode. And then if that's still not successful, maybe again re-examine yourself, and then perhaps that would be a time to like change churches, perhaps if it was like so deeply inflicted upon your conscience. But that's why we have the structure set up like we discussed in that episode.
But there's like a bit of a discussion that you need to have with yourself about like the responsibility you have to your church, to the local congregation, to the other congregants, and then also your conscience and how that's convicting you. If you can't raise your hands, but this church body needs you as a member of this body, perhaps there's a discussion to be had with yourself, with others about that.
Very quickly, like to give an example of this, and it's kind of where I really started thinking about these things. I don't know if you guys know the name Paul Vanderklay.
Yes.
Oh yeah. So he runs, like, he's doing some pretty cool stuff in California.
Yeah.
CRC pastor. I do not align myself with the CRC at all. No. Right. But I can tell with what he's doing and how he talks, he's a Christian.
Oh yeah.
Without a doubt. He's got a deep relationship with God, and he's doing some great stuff, some great kingdom work. But then I was listening to a podcast episode with him where he was clearly supporting women in office in the church. And that was like, I really had to wrestle with that, because I'm firmly convicted 100% that is not biblical. But I also had to consider, okay, he is a Christian, clearly.
Yep.
I don't think that his salvation is in peril because he thinks this. Yep. There must be some sort of freedom of conscience in that area.
Yeah.
There must be, because it doesn't say that your salvation is dependent on faith in Christ's sacrifice and no women in office, right?
Right.
Now there are biblical principles, and that's why I'm convicted, but he also would have biblical principles for why he's convicted. Yeah. So we must acknowledge some sort of...
Yeah, but there's still, like, you could be right and he could be wrong.
Could be, absolutely.
Now,
and that's why, I mean...
So to pose it as freedom of conscience is like, I get like the raise your hands, sing this song with a guitar or this song with an organ. I get that. That's like, to me, that's like trivial, like conscience kind of things. But like when you get into stuff like that, that's like kind of like a different tier of like,
but But if salvation is not dependent on that, he could be wrong. I could be right. I could be wrong. He could be right.
Right.
We have to acknowledge that there is some sort of freedom there. It doesn't negate having convictions, because convictions come from God, from the Holy Spirit. And if they come from the Holy Spirit, we're supposed to live them out.
Yeah. Right? You couldn't say that's not a true church, I don't think.
Right.
Like, I don't think you can make a case for
Perhaps it's not a church that I would go to.
Because it affects your conscience. Because
exactly.
Right.
Yeah. So I would find a church that I can live out my conscience. No women in offices in the church.
Yeah.
Right.
And it does say, like, doesn't Paul say, like, don't bind the consciences of others?
Yeah.
And like, they relate that with food, right? Or Peter did.
Yeah, with the Jews and
like,
the Gentiles.
Don't make him eat something he doesn't want to eat. Don't,
and make him get circumcised.
Don't eat because he doesn't want to eat. Like, don't be,
And we can tie this all the way back into the beginning of discussion of ideas. This is why we have to discuss ideas, right?
Yeah.
Because if someone has a different conviction than you, one of you might be right, one of you might be wrong. And together, if you have these conversations, you can develop a deeper understanding of the truth. Mm-hmm. And then that is also how God works convictions in you, through discourse with other Christians. Mm-hmm. Iron sharpening iron, right?
Yep.
So that's...
There
we go.
Proverbs on the wall.
Yeah, absolutely.
I saw Mike's eyes light up when he had like the greatest segue to wrap this thing up. He was like,
tie it
I got
all
it
together.
Don't worry. I'll end this thing.
That was great. I think we will leave it there. We're at the hour and a half mark. So
yeah.
Thanks so much.
That was pretty tight. That was good.
Man,
That was a fun discussion.
Yeah.
I enjoyed it.
Yeah.
lots of fun.
That was
Very
great.
freeing, honestly.
Yeah, that's freedom. Just keep aiming at it through discussion. So keep having real talk, keep learning, keep
stuff.
talking. We'll catch you next time, folks.
Cheers.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Real Talk. You can send us your feedback by emailing us at reformedrealtalk@gmail.com. You can find us on social media by looking for the handle Reformed Real Talk. You can find us online by going to realtalkpodcast.ca. We look forward to your feedback, as that's what helps us grow and improve as podcasters. Real Talk is produced by myself, Lucas Holfluer, Tyler Vanderwood, and Tim Van Woudenberg. The theme music was created by Calvin Hutten. The table and cabinet behind me were made by Ethan Vanderwood of Eureka Woods. And finally, this sign in the studio was made by Zebra Signs. That's it for now, folks. Catch you next time. Bye-bye.